Hello everyone, welcome to the 30-second iOS tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll talk about another important subject, which is database. And we use core data method for adding our data inside of the database. We have another method which is SQLite, but it's highly recommended to use core data, which is more powerful. This is part one, and in this part we will talk about NS manage object context, NS entity description, and how do we add entities and adding attributes. So let's move on. Here's the final app at the end of part 1, core data. We have a simple database. It contains name, last name, and student ID. And we want to receive it from the user and add it to the database. And we have some output here, and it shows some log of what we're going to do and what is added to the database. So for example, I would the name, last name like GH, and student ID I put 1212. And add it to the database. As you can see, this is kind of like a log to show we added this last name, name, and student ID. Okay, let's create a new project, Xcode. And it's a single view. We call it core data P1, part 1. And make sure that this use core data check mark. And Objective-C. And create the project. So it's like other projects as we created, has some storyboard. Let's add some field, like text field for input. It should be here. In order to save some time, I added all of the necessary field, name, last name, student ID, and some button. You can add some output here. This is a text view. It shows multiple lines of text, and let's expand it to the bottom of the view so we can see all of the logs and outputs. So this is a preview text, and you can just delete it and say output. So it would show the preview of output. In order to have some constraints for the view for auto layout, this is a horrible thing to do, but just for this tutorial I will choose this option and say reset to suggested constraint. So all of the view elements have constraints, but this is horrible constraints. If you want to have proper constraints, you have to watch the auto layout tutorial. But for now, this is perfect fine for our view elements. Let's hook it up with the controller. We can go to automatic and view controller. This is a class of this view controller. So we just control drag. Let's just remove these functions. Control drag from the fields. This is a name field. I call it name field. This is last name field. I call it last name field. And this is student ID field, student ID FI. And this is our action basically, so it should be inside of the implementation. So okay, we can call it, this is a type of button, we can call it add to database. And also we have this field, which is text view, and we can say output text view. So now all view elements are hooked up. Okay, let's look at the structure of the project and see what has changed. If you notice, we have a core data p1.xc data modeled. So by check mark the core data at the beginning of the project, we have this little file here. It's not a little, it's very useful. So if I select it, you'll see this view. And here's the place that you can add your entities to your database. So if I press this button, which is called add entity, I can create an entity. So as soon as I create it, the entity name will show up here. I can double click and add a name for it, students. So I call it students. So this entity could have attributes. So in order to have attributes for it, I go ahead and the plus button and say attribute. So it has student ID, and it needs the type. If I don't choose a type, I would see an error here. As soon as I select it, the error goes away. So the other field is name, and also the ID is string. The type is string, sorry. And last name, it's also string. So you can choose student ID as int or anything that you want, but I prefer to use string here. So that's all for our entity. If you want to add another entity, we can go ahead and add this button for another entity. We can see this editor, we have this view. If I click on this button here, I would see the table, and you can see this is my students entity, and it has 3 attributes and no relation. In a simple core database, we won't have relations. We could have multiple entities and have some relations between them, but just for the sake of simplicity, I chose not to have some relations. But the next thing that we're gonna do is have some object-oriented talking with database like object-oriented. So if I select this and then go to the editor and select this option, which is create NSManage object subclass. If I create it, it will ask the core data, which is our model, and then I select this. This is the entity that I want to add subclass of it. I select it and hit next, and make sure it's inside of the project. So this is the core data, this is our project, so I create it. I don't know why it adds it up there, but it's fine. We can just drag it over here. Yes, I see, and delete this to, should be, I'll remove the reference, but yeah, that's all. So if you look at the det.h file, students, it has all of the fields that we created for our entity, student ID, name, last name, and if we see the implementation file, .m file, it just say dynamic, and what it means is that it doesn't need this synthesize, it knows what it has to do with this object. So in order to tell the compiler not to give me an error or warning that we have not synthesized it, it just add this @ dynamic. So don't worry about this @ dynamic. We won't touch it. It's just the way it is. And now we can call the database and add our method for adding the objects. So I can go ahead and add a function that adds all of the items that I want to put inside of the core data. But there's a problem by adding directly in this .m file, and it's because if I one day I want to add another attribute here, or even add another entity. For example, I want to have students' preferences as an attribute. I have to have this file again. I have to recreate them, and the way that we recreate is, again, we click here and then go to the editor and create the NSManage object class. But if I modify this class manually, I will lose all of my methods. So it's not a good idea to add my manual methods, like the ones that I created by myself, inside of these two in students.h or .m file. So how should I do that? How should I subclass it? Here is the place that we create a new file, and this is the first time that we are creating. And instead of Coca class, we select this Objective-C. First of all, it should be an iOS, but it doesn't matter. It's Objective-C file. And if you select this, it would ask what kind of file you want. And we have to select category. This is the first time we use category. If you remember, we had protocol, but this time is category. And the category we want to subclass is the students. What is the students? It's our entity. So what is the name of the entity? We will select it here. And we want to say add category. Yeah, we just call it add. And it will add the add at the end. So if you see how it adds the file, you can just create it and see the name. It just adds an add sign and the add word. Now we can go ahead and add our method inside of the student plus add.m file for inserting the objects inside of the core data or our database. So this time I want to use a class method. And class method starts with plus. We always use instance methods, which starts with minus, but for this tutorial, it's better to use class methods for adding items. And the way that you figure out it's better to have class methods or instance methods is based on your experience and working with class methods and instance methods, because they have some limitations, and you will see some benefits and pros and cons, and you can compare and see which one to select. So for this particular purpose, I will use class methods. And what it wants to return, I want to return the entity, which is our student class or student instance. So it returns this entity, and the name of the function, it could be add student info from. So here's the place that we can pass an argument to add the data. For example, we can set from text field, from the text view, but it's better to have a dictionary to have all of the items for this entity. For example, a dictionary that contains the name, last name, and student ID. So I will pass a dictionary. I would say add student ID from dictionary, and later we will create a dictionary and pass this dictionary to this function, ns dictionary, and we call it student info. So now we can implement our function. First of all, we need a context. Application should know what context we are going to add the data. So the way that we get the context is by 2 lines of code and getting the help from the app delegate. The app delegate class is here, and we have to just import it here. Import and say app delegate. And the way that we use it is just say app delegate, and we call it app delegate equals, and we cast app delegate. You can just copy paste these 2 lines to get the context, but UI application, shared application, and delegate. Okay, and then we can get the context with ns managed context. I call it context. Forgot the star, and equals app delegate that we just created. No, with this small letter app delegate. Yes, and then managed context, object context. So this is how we got the context. If you see this error, it's because it should return student and we have not still creating that. So I would say, okay, I would create a students, and I call it student entity. And for now, I put it nil, and I can return this student entity for getting rid of this error that were bothering me. Now here we can create the new object. So I put a comment, create a new object. So how do we create a new object? So we have the student entity instance, and student entity instance has these properties. So we can use these properties and add our object. So we would call it a student entity, and then it has student ID, and for student ID we equalize by using the student info that we will pass. It's a dictionary, so we say student info and value for key. So we will add a key inside of the dictionary with student ID. So just copy paste it from here. Student ID. Same thing for name. So I would just copy paste these 3 times. Instead of student ID, I would say name, and this time last name. And for key, I say name and last name. Make sure you watch the both tutorial. This is just part 1. This code is incomplete yet. We will complete it in a second tutorial. But before that, in order to get the entity, we need to say student entity equal, because we put it equal to nil, but let's give it some value and initialize it. We would say ns entity description insert new object from entity for name. And how do we get this name? It's entity name. If we go to our core data, this is our entity name, so it's students. So I would just call it here @ students. And in manage context, so we would give the context that we created, context. And that's it. That's all we have to do to add our object inside of the database. So now we should call this method inside of our view controller. So when the user press this button, it adds the information inside of the database. So we go to the view controller, and we have to get it some logic to add this function. So first of all, we should create the dictionary to pass it to this method, because this method needs a dictionary to pass. So we have to first make it public, so this class can see this method. We would add this method in .h file, so other class can see this method. So I would go to this controller and import our student. Import student. We can just include only student.h, and it will automatically add this student plus add. So if you just include this method, it will know all of the available method in student plus add. So I will go back to this and create a dictionary. So how do we create a dictionary? We would say ns dictionary. It says student info equal, and we can create a dictionary on fly. I may talk about it, I'm not sure, but this is how we create a dictionary on fly. We don't initialize, we don't say anything, we just put the key value, and key value like this. For example, this is a key and this is a value. So this dictionary includes 1 key and 1 value, and we separated the next one with this comma. So we can add two key values for this, and right now we have three key values, which is name, last name, and student ID. So I would say we have a key name, then we have a key last name, and we have a key called student ID. And how do we get the value of it? The value for name is this text field value. So we would say self dot name field dot text. So we get the text value of this field. Same thing for last name. This is the value. So instead of name field, we call last name. And also student field. So for the value of student ID, we would say self dot student field dot text. So here's the dictionary that we're gonna pass to our student class. So this is how we're gonna call the class methods. We don't need to create an instance for that class. We just say students, the class name, and then we can say start calling our method. What is our method? Is add student info. So I go back to this and say add. Oh, sorry. Add. Okay. It seems that we have to student and student. We apologize. I told you lie. We have to import this one and plus add. So the add student info from dictionary, and we pass our dictionary student info. Student info. So that's all we have to do for adding the data. So let's run the program and see what we get. Okay, let's just test our app. I added some name, last name, and some ID. So added to database, but nothing showing in output area. Why? Because we never set the output text view. So how do we set some log for it? Almost all of the Objective-C classes has a property called description. And what it does, it just gets the object and try to make it as string. Describe it as a string. It's kind of like toString function in other languages. So what I can do, I can just set the output text view self.output text view.text equal to the description. You can use this description property for all other functions like NSArray. If you use it for NSArray, it gives you a description for NSArray. Separate each items with comma. For dictionary, it will show all of the key values and etc. You can use it. And also, we made one small error. It's not small, but look at this key. The n is lowercase, but here in student.add we put the capital N. So we should make sure we set all of the key values equal to the same. So I would suggest just copy paste it. Whatever you name it, you just copy paste it. So we would have these three key values, and now we can run the program and see what it adds. Okay, we can add the same name, so last name and some student ID, and now we can see last name, name, student ID. That's all for this tutorial. Make sure that you watch the next tutorial, which is completing this tutorial, and make it best practice. So see you next time.